This is the biggest up this sport has ever seen. The government demolished our old speedway only to overspend taxpayers' money to build a new speedway. No one wanted to run the place because of a long list of defects and it being a financial mess. Then they handed the keys to a completely different sport to run, thinking they'd do a good job, only for them to raise the operating cost and put someone else in charge, someone who has no prior involvement in speedway. Oh yeah, and the self-proclaimed CEO is a bankrupt. How does this keep getting up? Three things. Firstly, to make sure this video doesn't go forever, here's how this is going to work. I'm going to lay out all of the info and facts that I have, and then let you know my thoughts on each part as we go. Secondly, if you haven't watched our previous video on the Eastern Creek Speedway saga, make sure you watch it before watching this one, because it explains everything up until now in great detail. I did a great job. And finally, before we get too far into this, I have to thank this video's sponsor. This video has been made possible by onlytrucks.com. No matter whether you're buying or selling a prime mover, a tilt tray, a rigid, a water truck, a refrigerated truck, a tipper, or even a crane truck, onlytrucks.com.au is the solution for you. You see, unlike other vehicle selling platforms, Only Trucks doesn't charge the buyer a huge fee every single time someone clicks on their ad, only to then pass it on to the customer. Instead, Only Trucks charges a monthly fee for dealers and a one-off fee for private sellers, allowing sellers to sell and buyers to buy at the right price. But wait, there's more. Their alliance with Credit One Finance provides an inbuilt finance indicator, instantly letting you know possible repayment options and offering low-rate finance solutions on the entire Only Trucks range. The whole process couldn't possibly be simpler. They truly are the one-stop shop for trucks, Only Trucks. So, whether you're buying or selling a truck, the only place is our partner, onlytrucks.com.au. Let's talk about what's happened since our last Sydney Speedway video. On Thursday, 14th of September, 2023, I posted on the Sprinker Hub socials that Eastern Creek Speedway had closed. That afternoon, I was asked to talk about it all on Sydney's 2GB radio show.
Right, the Eastern Creek Speedway doesn't look like it's up to scratch. Well, everybody that we've rung has said call Toby Belbowen. He runs Sprint Car Hub.
And then again the next day for both Channel 7 and Channel 9.
$100 million has gone to a track that's just not fit for purpose. You got inferior lighting, the seating is too close. The drainage is a massive issue.
After all of the media attention, the New South Wales government's Minister of Planning and Public Spaces, Paul Scully, knew he had a boil on his ass and needed to get rid of it quickly. Let's also not forget to realise that the Speedway season was meant to start the very next week, with the original lease to commence on September 23. As mentioned in the previous video, this entire time there has been numerous Speedway industry people wanting to steer this whole project in the right direction. This instance was no different when, within a week of all of this drama going down, prominent Speedway industry experts attempted to get in contact with Greater Sydney Parklands but couldn't even get a return phone call. Those same prominent Speedway people then got into contact with Sydney Dragway chairman Tony Buke. More on Tony in a minute, but this communication wasn't a silly idea considering it's understood that Sydney Dragway originally tended to run the venue themselves back in 2021. How do I know? I've got the tender for us all to look at. By this time, it was early October when Tony Buke confirmed to these interested people, multiple groups I should add, that Sydney Dragway had already obtained the lease to run the venue. Remember, this is early October. Why them? Well, you could say it's because the Dragway and Speedway could then share parking spaces, cross-promote and run events cohesively, and you'd like to think that the potential dust clause issue would no longer be an issue. Or you could easily assume the Labor government relied on their fellow long-time Labor worker, Tony Buke, to take control of the issue. A handful of meetings ensued between Sydney Dragway and the Speedway industry people, with the idea that the latter would run Speedway events on behalf of the former. Things progressed to the point that even a media day was planned by the government for October 23 to announce the new partnership. And here's where it all started to go pear-shaped. Ahead of the October 23 announcement, Sydney Dragway handed the Speedway people a sublease, something that had never been discussed in the previous handful of meetings. A slight omission. Basically, instead of Sydney Dragway actually operating the venue, they just wanted to become the middlemen, adding on their own licensing fee. A worse deal than what the previous operators walked away from. Not to mention the unknown maintenance costs, which I spoke about in our previous video. No wonder the Dragway quickly took over the lease. They were just going to pass on the costs anyway. Unsurprisingly, the Speedway people suggested to the Drags and the government, you better cancel that media day. But the Speedway people didn't give up. They then directly contacted Greater Sydney Parklands, whilst Sydney Dragway spoke to other potential operators, knowing they already had the lease. Meanwhile, this whole time, many others are trying to get in contact with the government and are met with this generic email which reads, GSP is committed to ensuring the successful operation of the Speedway for the 2023-2024 racing season. For promoters, please be advised that we are not taking meetings on the Speedway at the moment, as we are still reviewing options based on legal, probity and procurement requirements. So they didn't want to talk to promoters, but Sydney Dragway already said they have the lease. American motorsports media outlet Speed Sport announced on November 9, our November 10, that Sydney Dragway had the lease. Then came November 11, where the official announcement was made that Western Sydney International Dragway had adopted the lease of the Speedway venue and, like I said before, was trying to get someone else to manage or operate it. Funnily enough, the release was dated from 2 days earlier and the comments of the post were disabled. If it were great news, wouldn't you want comments? Sprinker Hub would never do such a thing. As I said via our Sprinker Hub posts, effectively, they've been given the site and can add on their own fee to whoever decides they want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to run it. It's great to finally have some public answers after hearing nothing from the government or previous promoters themselves and very little from anywhere else. Time will tell if this is a good thing for the sport or not. I genuinely hope it is. The point about Sydney Dragway not operating the venue themselves is a key point here because in the tender criteria, it was a requirement for the proponents to outline how they planned on running the venue. Something that Sydney Dragway did in their 647-page tender document. Holy shit. If you write 647 pages for something, you clearly want it. But why would they want it so bad if they didn't want to operate it themselves? In the tender criteria, the 5 key points that needed addressing were financial offer, financial capability, experience, operational plans, and lease terms. A month later, a Facebook page by the name of Sydney International Speedway was created. In hindsight, this was quite odd for 2 reasons. Firstly, a venue operator had not yet been appointed, and secondly, a meeting was scheduled for the next day by Greater Sydney Parklands with the aim to explore opportunities outside the regular racing season that would see the venue activated and used by the Speedway community in both the short and longer term. Did they really think the Speedway industry people were interested in exploring opportunities outside of the regular racing season? Anyway, on the day of the meeting, a pretty damning article from the Save Sydney Speedway page came out. Mark Hinchelwood, who was a director of Sydney Dragway at the time they put together their tender, spoke out and said, "It's a sweetheart deal. Minister Paul Scully has offloaded the problem from his desk onto Sydney Dragway. And in return, Sydney Dragway receives a financial benefit. It's a win-win for both." He went on to say, "The tender we assembled for Sydney Dragway was centered around operating the Speedway. It was a couple of 100 pages long, including our proposed annual calendar featuring Speedway, bikes, and community events." When asked if the current operations at Sydney Dragway resembled their tender, Hinchelwood bluntly responded, "No. What is happening today bears no resemblance to our tender. It's completely changed." Then came the meeting. Most notably, the independently facilitated roundtable meeting was attended by Speedway industry people, Speedway Australia, the Australian Racing Drivers Club, who run the Sydney Motorsports Park Circuit, the Office of Sport, and Tony Buke from Sydney Dragway. I wasn't there, but from what I'm told, the idea of discussing activations outside of the regular racing season were quashed rather quickly. Tony Buke was asked 3 times why Sydney Dragway had taken the lease if they had no intention of running it. From all accounts, that question was never really answered before the room discussed options to open the Speedway, with the main issue being that the lease needed fixing. Options discussed were for Sydney Dragway to run it, Sydney Dragway to find a sub-leasee, the government to run it like what happened in Perth in 2016, or a not-for-profit organisation formed. Then, The very next day after the meeting, December 13, a company by the name of Sydney International Speedway Proprietary Limited was registered. Clearly, things were progressing. But as far as the industry and public were concerned, there was still no operator. With the prime time of the season fast approaching, pressure from the speedway industry was beginning to build, to the point that I'm told the government put pressure on Sydney Dragway to find an operator before close of business on Friday, December 22. As time went on, they got increasingly desperate, and on the afternoon of Friday, December 22, the company Sydney International Speedway Proprietary Limited was appointed as the operator. Of course, Minister Scully endorsed the appointment with a release stating, "After the previous government bungled the establishment of the new speedway at Eastern Creek, I am pleased that racing will return in early 2024." And even going as far to say, "We are working with the new management to make Eastern Creek the #1 motorsports precinct in Australia." This is where things really start to get interesting, because the government's release didn't include any quotes from the new operator. So we had no idea exactly who they were. Now, I'm paraphrasing and skimming through here, but the original tender criteria required the proponent meet the standards for financial offer, financial capability, experience, operational plans, and lease terms. And on top of all of that, the lease agreement states a sublease can happen if the leasee has given the leaseor, in this case Greater Sydney Parklands, at least 1 month's notice in writing, is of good repute, and has demonstrable experience in successfully carrying on a business of the kind. Basically, it's on the government to do their due diligence in order to approve of anyone to take over what is now a project that has cost in excess of $110 million of taxpayers' money. So, we already know that there's no way that Sydney Dragway gave Greater Sydney Parklands a month's worth of notice, because the company was only registered 9 days before the announcement. But are they of good repute, and do they have experience in successfully carrying on a business of this kind? Well, we need to find the answer to who is Sydney International Speedway Proprietary Limited. Well, it turns out the new company's sole director is 76-year-old Yvonne Baldy. Whilst she is the director on paper, we have not seen or heard from Yvonne since the operator was announced. Instead, we've only heard from her son. It's all very confusing. Without wanting to sound too negative, yes, I made an effort to sound positive. When sharing the news on Sprinter Hub, I just stated that she registered the company on December 13th. Then came some more info the very next day when a lengthy post by Troy Baldy, her son, circulated on social media. Honestly, although it wasn't as professional as it could have been, it wasn't terrible and seemed to be written with heart. After all the sport in Sydney has been through, it was nice to read of someone who was putting their neck on the line for the benefit of the sport. As he wrote, "We have just signed up to take on the responsibility as the speedway operators. It's my pleasure to be in this position, to be building a team. As one of my team members said today, huge thanks to my team of workers and staff. I hope you are all with me, my staff. I'm excited to be on this new venture." Before signing off with, "Cheers, Troy Baldy, Sydney International Speedway." My understanding, and I think everyone else's understanding, was that he would be running the place, or at the very least, heavily involved. And well, he did change his Facebook bio to CEO at Sydney International Speedway. But again, I personally did not know of him, so I did some research, and this time I found some more info. Okay, without getting unnecessarily personal, I think it's only fair to stick to whatever is relevant to the tender, because really, with this video, I just want to evaluate where the future of this venue is using facts. So, is he of good repute? Well, it doesn't seem so. He went bankrupt in October of 2022. Not only is that not a good sign in terms of handling money, but according to the Australian Securities and Investments website, an undischarged bankrupt cannot be involved in the management of a company unless authorized by the court. Moving on. Does he have experience in successfully carrying on a business of this kind? From what I could find, I'm not sure. He had a rent-to-buy business about 15 years ago. He ran Wollongong Kart Track, took over a business called Homebush Karts, and also started his own karting organization, all of which are currently not functioning. So what has happened since the announcement? Well, it's been almost 2 months since the company was registered, and you'd be crazy to think that we'd have any racing before now. But there has clearly been work going on behind the scenes. Most notably, the track reshaping. Speedway driver Marty Perovich has purchased a grader for the venue, and he himself has been working tirelessly to change the length, width, shape, and banking of the track. Oh yeah, and I guess the name of the venue, I guess, has been unofficially changed to Sydney International Speedway, but there hasn't been any announcement of that. And we've had very minimal updates from their sole social media page on Facebook. One on January 18, which wrote that Troy Baldy had been appointed the venue operator, which also had an image attached showing Troy Baldy, Tony Buke, and manager Garry Wilmington. It all kind of seemed to quiet down for a while there until early February. On the 2nd, Marty Perovich's track curation efforts were praised in a post. On the 5th, an email was sent through the New South Wales Sprint Car Club telling members that the upcoming Saturday's practice event had been cancelled. And the latest post on Wednesday, February 7, which hyped up the return of life at the venue, announcing practice nights to be held this same month, along with some race dates subject to authority approval. I've never seen that written and seems odd considering there were whispers they were struggling to obtain the necessary permits from the Office of Sport. Surely with the government involved, that would have been sorted by now. There is no website right now, but the domain name, sydneyinternationalspeedway.com.au, is registered and was done so on December 22. Oddly, the domain name is not registered by Sydney International Speedway, not even by Sydney Dragway, but instead by Tony Buke's business, Buke & Buke, with Troy Baldy's email listed as tech contact. But why would Tony Buke have another company's website domain name registered under his own business? Why wouldn't Troy just register it himself? Is he legally not allowed? Why didn't Yvonne register it? Where has Yvonne been this entire time? And then things really blew up that Friday, February 9, when that morning, longtime Speedway journalist Dennis Newlyn and sprint car racing legend Garry Rush spoke on popular Sydney radio station 2GB with host Ray Hadley. Here's what was said.
I said I'd try to get to the bottom of the Eastern Creek Speedway fiasco. It's cost close to $100 million of taxpayers' money. Now, the Sydney National Dragway, they're concentrating on drag racing out there, which is fine. Then they on-sold it or on-leased it. But anyway, the blokes in charge now are two blokes called Troy Baldy, Garry Wilmington. Then I get a note from someone this morning who said, you better have a look at the sequestrant order, which is extracted this year from the Australian Financial Security Authority about a bankruptcy. The date of bankruptcy was 18th October 2022, which would mean this person, I'd imagine, is still an undischarged bankrupt, and his name's Troy Baldy. I mean, how does an undischarged bankrupt get his hands on a government asset worth $100 million? Where is Paul Scully? Does he know about it? Does the Western Sydney Parklands know about it? This is more complicated than Chinese arithmetic. I just can't believe it.
Of course, it was sub-leased to Sydney International Speedway, which is Troy Baldy and Garry Wilmington. We've missed season after season in Sydney, and it also affects the industry. The whole industry has collapsed because of Eastern Creek Speedway.
I went to government and asked who's advising how to build this track, and it fell on deaf ears. I was only talking to the guys for a couple of minutes. I realised I was talking to the wrong people. They knew nothing about our sport. The problem is spent $100 million on a speedway that a sport can't afford. You know, the people in Western Australia had the same problem when they built their speedway, and they've resolved it. There's a lease there. Look, anyone that puts their name to that lease needs their head read. It's costing nearly $1 million a year to open the place up, and the sport can't afford that.
How did Troy Baldy, an undischarged bankrupt, get his mitts on a $100 million government asset? How did that happen? No due diligence has been done, but you can't sign a lease where one of the signatories is an undischarged bankrupt and say, here's a $100 million government asset, see if you can make it work. That doesn't happen in the business world. It can't happen.
It's just a devastation, Ray.
The first thing I've got to do is find out the minister responsible, because I don't think they know who's responsible.
It was labelled as a world-class facility. Well, Ray, it's not. It was, no one listened.
I don't have any fault here with the people involved from the Dragway. I mean, you know, they concentrate on drag racing, not on speedway. And so it was too hard for them, too hard basket. They give it to someone else with due diligence, and one of the two blokes to give it to is an undercharged bankrupt. How does an undercharged bankrupt, I repeat, get his hands on $100 million government asset.
In the direct aftermath, there seemed to be an instant cull of Troy Baldy's involvement in the whole project, even going as far to delete his name from their own posts on Facebook, although keeping the image of him, and removing the CEO title from his personal Facebook bio. Now, let's just pause for a minute. I get hounded constantly for info on what is happening at Eastern Creek. With a major radio network realizing this was big news, I shared it on Spring Car Hub too. I want to be positive about this sport more than anyone, and I think you'll find that we do share a lot of really positive stuff, but I don't make the news. And so if the update does seem negative, that is not my fault. You got your update. Unfortunately, it wasn't great news. Knowing a lot of what was discussed on 2GB, I contacted Tony Buke myself, along with Greater Sydney Parklands and Minister Scully's office. In the email, I attached some documents and quizzed them. I wrote, the documents show that the sole director of Sydney International Speedway Proprietary Limited is Yvonne Baldy. Press releases show Troy Baldy alongside Tony Buke and Garry Wilmington. Troy Baldy declared himself as CEO of Sydney International Speedway. Troy Baldy is an undischarged bankrupt. What due diligence did Sydney Dragway undertake prior to appointing Troy Baldy CEO of Sydney International Speedway, given that he is an undischarged bankrupt? What due diligence did Sydney Dragway undertake prior to appointing Yvonne Baldy, director of Sydney International Speedway, given that she is a discharged bankrupt? Is Sydney Dragway aware that it is an offence under ASIC laws for an undischarged bankrupt to be involved in the management of a company? Why is Tony Buke the registrant of Sydney International Speedway .com.au through his personal company, Buke & Buke Proprietary Limited, where website registration lists the tech contact email, troy.baldy@gmail.com. Tony Buke replied almost immediately, but only partly answered the website question. He said, "Hi Toby, will respond to those comments that are directed at me personally. The domain name sydneyinternationalspeedway.com.au was secured by me personally before the name could be taken. I also registered westernsydneyspeedway.com.au at the time as well. The domain name has been transferred to Sydney International Speedway Proprietary Limited at no cost. The registrant details do take some time to change." Of course, I wrote back straight away saying, "Thanks Tony. Is there a more suitable person you suggest would be able to answer the other questions on behalf of the Sydney Dragway? The only Sydney Dragway representative from the attached November 9 release is yourself." But I haven't received a reply from Tony for a few days now. The next day, I got a response from Minister Scully's office, and again, I'll skim through it, but they said, "Hi Toby. All further inquiries should be directed to Sydney International Dragway as the leaseholder for the Speedway." Funny that, I did contact the chairman of the Dragway and he only partly answered the website question. The government entered a lease with Western Sydney International Dragway to manage the Speedway site. Western Sydney International Dragway subsequently entered into a sublease with Sydney International Speedway to operate the site and run raceway events. As part of the subleasing process, Western Sydney International Dragway is obliged to carry out due diligence and ensure that subleasing requirements are satisfied, including that the proposed operator is a fit and proper person to carry out the obligations under the sublease. Ouch. Already throwing the Dragway under the bus. I mean, we've already established that legally the government needed to do their due diligence, and Scully endorsed the appointment in his release as well. Yvonne Baldy is sole director and secretary of Sydney International Speedway, working closely with head leasee Sydney International Dragway. Troy Baldy is not a registered owner of the company and is not a company director of Sydney International Speedway. SIS has appointed Garry Wilmington as operations manager of the venue. So Troy Baldy has nothing to do with it? No. SIS has engaged Troy Baldy in an advisory role to assist with operating and activating the venue. Troy operates Wollongong Kart Raceway. Remember how they were trying to remove his involvement? Well, now it seems he's an advisor, so he is involved. Also, he operates Wollongong Kart Raceway. He's not legally meant to operate anything. He's currently an undischarged bankrupt. Come this past Monday, February 12, the story featured in Sydney's Daily Telegraph, and 2GB's Ray Hadley went absolutely apeshit about it again.
I did have a rather animated conversation with the Planning Minister, Paul Scully, on Friday afternoon late, when he told me not to worry, that bloke's mum was in charge. Heard of a shadow director, minister? Come out from under the mushroom, where you're being fed BS, and come into the real world with the rest of us. Isn't it funny when things go wrong, ministers are always at arm's length? A bloke connected to the Labor Party awarded a contract to an undischarged bankrupt for a $100 million asset in Sydney's Western Eastern Creek. Now, if that's not something that needs investigation, I'm buggered if I know what does. And I have a blue with Paul Scully on Friday afternoon, and the best he can do about the Speedway, Oh, Ray, you're wrong about that bloke, Baldy. He's not the CEO. His 76-year-old mother is the director. You're kidding, Paul Scully. The Planning Minister, Paul Scully, in December announced among a fever pitch a new venue manager for the Speedway, selecting Western Sydney International Dragway, which is chaired by a long-time Labor member and former Liverpool Deputy Mayor, Tony Buke. The operation of the government-owned facility was then subleased to the Sydney International Speedway Pty Limited, a business only registered 9 days before Scully's announcement. Documents obtained by the Telegraph state Mr Baldy isn't undischarged bankrupt, which, unless there's a court order, disqualifies him from managing a company. I mean, Scott Farlow, the opposition spokesman on such matters, said how this operator was chosen and given the keys to a multi-million-dollar facility is beyond me. Everywhere it's announced it's him. And then all of a sudden, the minister wants to tell me, oh, Ray, don't worry, it's not him, it's his mum. His 76-year-old mother. What's she running it from a nursing home, is she? Rort after rort after rort. You can't be that silly, Paul. You cannot be that stupid. And then when I challenged him on that, he starts saying to me, oh, Ray, look, the minister doesn't have carriage of these matters. Well, get another minister then. Because if you can't stick your buff head into this, you can't stick your buff head into anything. The one thing I hate is this level of corruption. And that's what it appears to be on a number of fronts. The ICAC will determine whether it is or isn't. They awarded the contract for the Dragway out there, for those interested in the drag racing, to the former Labor Deputy Mayor of Liverpool, Tony Buke. So he's the former Deputy Mayor, Labor man. I asked Paul Scully on Friday, you know him? Oh, I've had some contact with him, yeah. Okay, you know him, beauty, we've established that. So in December, they have the contract for the whole thing, for the Dragway and the Speedway. So Mr Buke decides, without any due diligence, he's going to hand the contract to a bloke called Troy Baldy. Minister Scully has no idea about Speedway, so he asked his Labor mate, Tony Buke, the former Deputy Mayor of Liverpool, who's chairman of the drag racing, if he'll manage the lease. Scully and Sydney Parklands give the lease to Drags, the Dragway. They don't want to run it, so they look for someone else to sublease it. The group that gathered and met with the Sydney Parklands Trust that know a bit about Speedway, they asked the government to administer the venue, as was the case when Perth Motorplex did not have a promoter. Troy Baldy can't get a licence from Sport and Rec as he has a history when running go-kart venues back in 2022, refused a licence. No due diligence done by Tony Buke, Sydney Parklands, or in fact Paul Scully. The only way it'll get fixed now is if the government administer the venue, put in an experienced board, which is a Speedway experience, then put in a Speedway people to manage the venue and work through the issues.
Okay, I want to wrap this up. I really just want to go racing, and I try to stick to talking about racing. Hopefully, you can see that making this video comes with an oozing passion for sprint car racing, especially Australian sprint car racing, and in particular here in Sydney. I wouldn't have such a strong opinion if I weren't so passionate about it. This particular video has taken me days to make, as most do. I want nothing more than to see this place be successful. So when I have all of this information, I ask myself if I can confidently say I have faith that this venue will reach its full potential anytime soon. And the answer is absolutely not. I can't confidently say that it will be good at all. And not because of the hard work that guys like Marty Perovich and Garry Wilmington have been putting in behind the scenes, but because of two reasons. One, the place needs serious financial backing. It's so obvious that these people lack the ridiculous amounts of funding required to make this happen. In fact, a number of wealthy speedway industry people looked at the business model and realized that it just could not work. And two, it's already going pear-shaped. Let's be clear here. Sydney International Speedway didn't appoint themselves. Greater Sydney Parklands and Sydney Dragway did. Every single piece of information I've presented in this video, other than emails, is easily found by searching the internet. Did Greater Sydney Parklands or Sydney Dragway do any due diligence? Did Sydney Dragway provide the 1 month's notice in writing of proposed sublease? If not, Greater Sydney Parklands and the Dragway would not be adhering to its own lease terms. I love how Paul Scully is quoted as saying, after the previous government bungled the establishment of the new speedway, and then he himself says, hold my beer, and it up more. This one is on you, Paul Scully. How irresponsible can you be to think that you can swiftly offload a $110 million taxpayer-funded facility and then put the success and failure on someone else when you have an entire government department dedicated to do it properly? Your own department makes tender documents and then you bypass them anyway. You had one job, Paul Scully, but not just you, mate. Tony Buke too. Imagine the Sydney Dragway board putting together a 647-page tender, which included an operational plan and events calendar, because you wanted to run the place, only to then change your tender and palm it all off to the first person to take it. Are you really proud to put your name to that? And you expect the Speedway community to trust Sydney Dragway as a venue manager? And you've worked in government for how long? I'm not even trying to be that critical of the Boldies either. And this video is not at all intended to be personal against them. In this situation, anyone could have put their hand up to run the Speedway and they would have been accepted. But if they know that they don't have the $1 million plus that it will take to operate per season, they are only holding the sport back from proceeding and returning to its glory. Valvoline Raceway at Parramatta ran for 43 uninterrupted years before the government closed it down and got us into this mess. It's now been 10 months since we last saw premier speedway racing in Sydney. Could you imagine cricket not having the Boxing Day test for 3 of the last 4 years? If Greater Sydney Parklands doesn't want the Speedway, which clearly they don't, give it to someone else who does care. I believe the Office of Sport would take it on if instructed. It simply needs Premier Chris Minns to move the Speedway administration across to the Sports Minister. We cannot afford to have these people continue to make stupid decisions at the expense of our incredible sport. Every sport is susceptible to downturns of their own doing. We don't need the government's influence. As I've said on our Sprinker Hub socials before, the government needs to appoint an administrator just like Perth did in 2016. Look where they are now. There's no way that the government or Sydney Dragway have any idea of just how badly they've affected the sport of speedway. With that said, whoever you are and wherever you're from, please share this video. It's the easiest and best way you can tell these bureaucrats that you care about the sport.
I mean, given what happened at the Sydney Speedway, you can see that the New South Wales Department of Planning is being run by the Muppets at the moment. They have absolutely no idea. Wouldn't know their ass from their elbow.